Hello, everybody. Michael McGinnis here. This podcast, one of my favorite. They're all my favorite, right? But reality is this one provides a lot of profound thoughts and comments. It's titled "The Road Less Traveled," and it starts with my favorite sayings, and it's called "The Call." And I'll be referring to this later in today's recording. The call, it's throughout your life, there's a voice only you can hear, a voice which mythologists label the call, a call to the value of your life, the choice of risk and individual bliss over the known and secure. You may choose not to hear your spirit. You may prefer to build a life within the compound to avoid risk. It is possible to find happiness within a familiar box, a life of comfort and control. Or, which was my choice, you may choose to be open to new experiences, to leave the limits of your conditioning, to hear the call. Then you must act. If you never hear, perhaps nothing is lost. If you hear it, the call, and ignore it, your life is lost. By Jennifer James. I begin with a quote from M. Scott Peck, who authored the book, same as this recording, The Road Less Traveled. And he says, if your goal is to avoid pain and escape suffering, I would not advise you to seek higher levels of consciousness or spiritual evolution. Such a profound statement. It's been the story of so much of this path. One thinks that mysteriously everything sort of turns to a bed of roses when in effect there's lots of challenges. And ask, why would you do it? Well, let's talk about that, and I think I'll relate to some of that as we go through today's recording. I became accustomed to pain and suffering, a result from a traumatic and abusive past. I felt lost and all alone during my teens, continuing to desperately try to fit in so that I could be, quote, normal like everyone else. I ventured into my early adult life with low self-esteem, anger, depression, and a slew of unhealthy beliefs. The following quote sums up the impact from a traumatic or dysfunctional childhood, which actually describes the impact I experienced. It says, quote, children who were constantly ridiculed grow up to judge themselves harshly, lie, and constantly seek approval and affirmation. Children may fear abandonment. Yep. One for me. Believe they are unlovable. Yep. For me. Not good enough and feel lonely. Yep. Unfortunately, another one. And misunderstood. Amen. As adults, they face difficulty with forming professional, social, and romantic bonds. Yes, very much so. And are viewed as submissive, controlling, overwhelming, or even detached in relationships. Yeah, quite profound. And there's the source of that quote that's available in my actual blog posting of this. Over time, I would realize what M. Scott Peck meant by the opening quote above. Pain and suffering was what put me on the road less traveled. This led to a choice to succumb to this pain or to grow. My entry ticket to the road less travel was my choice to grow. The key word here is choice. Let's examine what Viktor Frankl defines as our choices. As we become an adult, we make our own choices. Many are unaware that they even have a choice, and our response that they take is a result of their choice, therefore making an automatic or unconscious choice, typically to whenever there's a situation. You know, these are covered. There's an image that you'll be able to see on the video of this that actually comes from Viktor Frankl, who authored a fantastic book based on experience, you know, within the concentration camp in Auschwitz, actually a place I visited and learned some real profound truths of the story of humanity. The two primary choices are discussed in this image. They are one, an automatic response, right? Something happens to us and boom, we immediately have a reaction. And it's that automatic response, this reaction to whatever our beliefs are, along with our prior experiences and perceptions of these experiences, which is what forms our beliefs. Our unhealthy beliefs lie deep in our subconscious and often result in a choice to be a victim or to blame others for our circumstances. So, hence the first one, a stimulus happens, somebody says something, we experience something, even though there's this sliver of time of a choice, which is the goal is to become conscious of that time and choose our response. Typically, when we have these unhealthy experiences, as I had, and we walk out into life, with that low sense of self-esteem compounded by unhealthy beliefs, we immediately respond, right? There's immediately met with anger or frustration or violence or whatever the case may be. The goal here is to really to achieve the second outcome, which is where you make a choice with awareness. You stop with that stimulus and you have that momentarily second or two to realize that you have a choice in terms of how to respond before you make that response. And that's where you have that awareness that you do have choices and you use your self-awareness to choose a healthy response, realizing that we are in charge of our life, right? Even if momentarily we begin to see and respond with anger, we recognize that because of the self-awareness and then quickly pull back, take deep breaths or whatever the case may be to sort of adjust it to a healthy response. The moment of truth is in that fraction of a second we have between the stimulus, the external event that happened to us, that we experience, and our response. So, for example, someone says hi to us, or it says, and then in the conversation, it say, "That's stupid." And this triggers an unhealthy belief that we are not worthy, right? Based on our past. We're not even aware of the fact that that's happening. But because we have these unhealthy beliefs, we automatically are triggered by our response to that based on what those beliefs are. So in this case, the stupid triggers an emotional response of anger and a behavior associated with this emotion. For example, yelling, hitting, screaming, violence, etc. As we become aware of these unhealthy beliefs and how they play out in our life, we use this self-awareness to momentarily stop, consider our options before we respond, and ultimately over time to reprogram these unhealthy beliefs into healthy ones, right? What a great sort of overview of this process of what I refer to as personal growth. One of the first three stages is personal growth, self-discovery, and then enlightenment. In my case, I reacted based on an unhealthy belief that I will never amount to anything. This was a line that my father repeated to me virtually every day I lived, from as young as I can remember. Blaming myself had the impact of a very low self-esteem, depression, and anger at myself, right? Many of those things we talked about earlier from that quote about what typically happens to children who experienced a lot of dysfunction or trauma in particularly their youth. These result in patterns where I would repeat behaviors, often unhealthy ones, that were consistent with my unhealthy beliefs. And again, I'm not conscious, I'm not even aware of this. Why? Because I feel like a victim, and all I'm doing is immediately responding to something without really any kind of conscious awareness because of the triggers that I'm experiencing or the buttons that were pushed. We form patterns where we repeat our reactions, triggered by our perception of what others do and say. My pattern was to desperately try to fit in and gain approval from others due to my unhealthy belief that I would indeed never amount to anything. So that was really how me being, first of all, told that over and over again, consistent with the other actions that I had in the abuse from my father, overall formed these beliefs inside of us that we're not even conscious of or aware that happens. But the belief in this particular case is that I am not worthy. I'll never amount to anything. So is it any surprise that my reactions to things would be based on that would not be good reactions? And it was that in my case, my actions and behaviors were characteristic of a victim, right? The question comes down to, do we remain a victim where we blame others for our negative patterns and consequences, which can lead to unhappiness, anger, violence, despair, or suicide? Or do we become a victor and decide to take charge of our life? Fortunately, and it took me a while to get there, I made the latter decision, but only having come very close to succumbing to the pain. I share this in my talks. It's a tough conversation, but it's real and very characteristic of those who do experience the trauma. And that was my brother committed suicide. And I understand that act because I had so many of those thoughts myself, again, because the pain can just be so much at time. Fortunately, it was making that choice. And the latter choice is the beginning of venturing onto new life or path, or in this case, the road less traveled. This is because we must confront and heal our past and learn to take responsibility for our own actions and make changes. It is not an easy choice to make, particularly in a society that promotes being a victim and where responsibility has become a four-letter word. The road less traveled is filled with obstacles, challenges, twists, and turns. It begins with confronting ourselves, our willingness to take that hard look within, understand what happened, heal your past, while learning how to create healthy beliefs that will drive our behaviors to make more positive consequences in our life. This, by definition, puts you on a different path, the road less traveled. It was easier to blame others for our life and therefore take no responsibility before. It was easier to have others tell us who we are, what we should do, how we should do it, how we should be, than it is to question and ultimately challenge these definitions and then learn to form our own definitions of happiness, success, lifestyle, etc. The turning point for me, was a time when that pain, as I mentioned before, became too much. I was able to hold myself together at work, but at home, it was a frantic mess. I felt all alone, scared, depressed. The cocktail for a very serious and possibly fatal choice. It would be years later, as I mentioned before, my brother committed suicide at a similar juncture in his own life. The difference between us was that I refused to succumb and instead sought help. It was a decision supported by a series of synchronistic events, what I now define as God's way of being anonymous. There were amazing people who came into my life who wanted to help me, not trying to fix me, but seeing something in me that I could not see myself. It was as if my choice to surrender, my pain and suffering, was in effect a chance to take charge, and it sent a wave of prayers to the universe, which began to line up events to support my request. With a nudge from a close associate who I called my adopted dad at work, and a supervisor who saw my potential and wanted to help me, a mentor at work whose own personal life change was used to inspire my own changes, and a colleague who suggested some next steps based on a background in psychology. These all had a huge impact at this particular point in time, this juncture. The result, I heeded their advice to talk to an EAP counselor at work, which led me in a counseling group and therapy. I made a choice to make improvements in my life. The change began with therapy. My counselor pushed me to look into my rear view mirror and talk about my past, something I strongly resisted at first. I came to understand why, right? Behind it was indeed Pandora's box. I would come to learn that I'd actually buried my past so deep into my subconscious, just simply as a result of the pain and suffering I had, that I had little recollection of what happened, along with major gaps in my conscious memory of my past. Although I wanted to quit counseling, my support team rooted for me to stay the course. I would later recognize that deep within me was an innate need to grow as a human being, which helped me to dig deep and find a new source of strength and courage. The decision to stay the course put me on the road less traveled. My circle of friends and connections started to change as I spent more time with others who I could relate to with respect to my past, who also had a desire to move forward. It's one of those challenges is that, we get connected to individuals, but as we change, there's a lot of challenging decisions that happen along the way. And one was that realization that I'm not connecting with my friends before. Or people didn't want me to change. They wanted me for who I was before. But as you make those changes, sometimes you've got to be able to change the circumstances around you. As with any major change we make, there are others that may not relate or be interested in what we are doing. Those that want us to be who we once were, or others to try to direct and influence our choices. I started to join support groups, another great resource. Attended workshops and conferences on topics related to the dysfunctional family at first, which is where I made new friends and became aware of some key issues I had developed as a result of my childhood. Over the course of the next 2 years, my personal growth was skyrocketing as I developed a healthier perception of myself, beliefs, self-esteem, and self-awareness. I peeled away some of the layers that I talk about in the many layers that as we peel away the onion, so to speak, in there we begin to start getting down to some of our core aspects. And with the awareness that we can change those things, which is the good thing, we're not stuck. And that's the great news about this whole concept of personal growth. It's a hard decision. Yes, it's one of the hardest decisions you'll make in life. But believe me, if it's the difference between the extent of the pain and suffering and the things that I had in my past, the challenges you might be experiencing, and to a time and a place of which you're happier, you have a stronger sense of self, you like who you are, believe me, it's worth all of the challenges many times over. The work would continue throughout my life due to the depth of the psychological impact from my youth. But I was out of the fog now and could see more clearly the choices I needed to start making. Some stop here and get off the road less traveled, having accomplished some of that personal growth, being a happier, more productive citizen, their mission accomplished. However, despite my attempt to exit, there was this gnawing feeling, so I could never really put a finger on, that something was still missing, and it kept me looking into the mirror, into my past. Wait a minute, what is that? Was it something I didn't do? As I put words to this in my journal, it related to a desire to understand why life is like this. For example, why did I have to experience so much pain? Was it me? Is it something wrong with me? Was it something unique to me? It was not until another trusted colleague placed the call, right, that I read to you a little bit, or as I began this recording, on my desk. And that's where so many of the concepts, the thoughts of this gnawing feeling began to start falling into place. It captured the essence of what I was thinking, and thinking without words or without understanding of what I was thinking. That yes, I had heeded the call. I had heard the call. I wanted to make this. Now came this whole nother aspect of the journey. As I look back over my life today, it is easy now to see the guidance I had from a greater source who continued to nudge me forward, whether you would refer to this as a higher self, angels, God, or whatever. As I read the call, wonderful tears erupted. This is it, I exclaimed, this is what I was missing. There was indeed something more, and now I could refer to this as hearing and a choice to heed the call. It was during this time that my mentor, a vice president in the company I was working for, had a bout with brain cancer and was given 6 months to live. OMG. I mean, wow, I couldn't even imagine that. As much as my challenges were tough in there, it was unbelievable to think of having to confront that. His mindset shifted as a mentor, And as you could imagine, his focus now was to nudge me out of the nest, right? No more holding back, is with limited time. He was ready, able, willing to just sort of say what was on his mind. He recognized my quest to grow as a human being versus a career at this point. And he asked me a profound question. Michael, what do you want to do with your life? My initial response recited to what society and others had taught me. He asked me to reflect on this question, which I did, right? Was it just to, get a job, get married, have 2.2 children, and so on and so forth? And as I thought about this and pondered on this and journaled on this intensively, it was weeks later, I was having dinner with a consultant that I was working with. And out of the blue, he asked me this another profound question. Michael, are you happy? My God, I mean, this a consultant, out of the blue, right? This amazing synchronicity, the people I was running into, right? Initially, I was just like thrown off and like just bothered by that question. Why? Because again, he clearly saw something about me that I didn't see myself. But as I was beginning to open up, I sort of allowed it to sort of unfold. Amazingly, both of these questions related so well to the call. The impact was so many sleepless nights of tossing and turning as I tried to dwell over these questions and try even to answer them. And then the epiphany came when a friend called a week later and asked if I wanted to go to Europe. Later in life, I would realize the amazing synchronicity of the timing of people and events around me. I wasn't aware of it at this time, but soon, and now as I look back, it clearly was. There was something there for me. This is what I would encourage journaling, sort of capture what happened as isolated events. And at some point later on, sort of see the synergy of what indeed was happening, or what I initially characterized as coincidences. My life until this point, felt as if I was barricaded behind a fence, and I could only look with wonder and frustration to what was out there. A life really, in effect, from within the compound to avoid risk, right? Those comments that came from the call. The image of a young child pondering on what was on the other side or out there came to mind. I actually drew this in my journal. The victim side of self saw this as life being unfair, while the new sense of self, who wanted to grow and discover life, represented this as my victor side, a chance to take charge of my life, a chance to break free. I took a leave of absence at work and traveled 4 weeks in Europe. I was like a little kid, excited to learn about the many unique cultures I visited there. History was measured in thousands of years compared to only hundreds here in the US. But it was the excitement I was feeling that caught my attention. It was a long time, and maybe the first time where I felt really passionate in my life. I returned home with an answer to the question of what I was asked. What do you want to do, Michael? What do you want to be? And in fact, it was to leave the known and secure, to discover what was out there, finding answers to the deep questions I was pondering. I talked to my mentor, who by this time was beating the odds with his prognosis. Right? Amazingly, he had come back and said that through several kinds of things that he was putting into practice, visualizations and affirmations, all that started to catch my attention because I was starting to get some of those same tools, as I refer to them, in my own counseling. And here he was, and finding a way that ultimately allowed him to beat out that 6-month prognosis. He was so proud of me, a feeling that was so new to me. He was that mother bird pushing me out of the nest so that I could learn how to fly. A couple of weeks later, I gave notice to my manager that I was leaving my job and company. Right after several years and all the growth that I had, she looked at me Google eyes and said, "Why?" Others thought I was crazy in there, but it was because I had changed. Counseling and group therapy, along with a considerable number of workshops, books, and intensive events, helped me to develop the courage to fully commit to the road less traveled. Right? There was another road to travel on. With a good self-esteem and more balanced life, I turned my attention to now what I refer to as self-discovery. As I mentioned, there's the three stages I wrote with respect to overall growth. The first being the personal growth, sort of taking care of dealing with the critical issues, getting you back on your feet. Self-discovery, which relates to really coming to grips with who am I? As I was getting asked that questions, they were all things about who am I? What do I want to be in life? And the third and ultimate one I'll address a little bit later is enlightenment. I turned my attention to self-discovery. Here, my focus was on discovering more about the man I saw in the mirror and addressing the question, who am I? This also included reformulating my values and beliefs, along with defining what success and happiness really meant to me. It was also about defining my purpose and finding new meaning ultimately in life. It was the following quote from Michael Crichton's own book, right? For some may know him as I believe he was the one behind like Jurassic Park and a number of great movies that were out there. And he wrote this sort of book that wasn't really even as known. And it was called Travels, that would characterize this part of my adventure. Often, and he says in there, often I feel I go to some distant region of the world to be reminded of who I really am. There is no mystery to why this should be so. Stripped of your ordinary surroundings, your friends, your daily routines, your refrigerator full of your food, your closet full of your clothes, with all of this taken away, you're forced into direct experience. Such direct experience inevitably makes you aware of who it is that is having this experience. That's not always comfortable, but it is always invigorating. What an insightful comment. Something that literally I would not even really fully come to understand or appreciate for years to come. But yet it was enough to nudge me forward. I quit. A great job for a backpack and an adventure of a lifetime. I said, life is going to be my teacher now. More so, it was the first time in my life that I felt free, along with feeling this inner drive to discover who I am and what life is all about. I had to understand why I experienced so much pain in my life. I had to get away from the known and go into the unknown. Wow, this comment itself, I'll just zoom ahead years. A great individual, YouTube videos and things, Joe Dispenza. He actually talks much more in depth about the unknown and looks at this whole concept of change from a scientific perspective, which amazingly runs so parallel to the spiritual adventure that I was on. For here, I would be able to answer the deep and profound questions that swirled in my head. It was during my journey that I learned about the tradition of the vision quest with the American Indians, where young men were kicked out of their tribe and to return only when they had their quote vision to identify who and what they were all about. A good sort of modern day representation of this is in the movie Dances with Wolves. And that great movie, by the way. Kevin Costner is one of the primary characters in that. It portrays this concept so well that my own journey was now labeled a modern day vision quest. Since I had returned, I was very fortunate to have been asked to talk on this topic, something I really look forward to continue, because it's just an evening of storytelling about the incredible adventures I experienced in a period of approximately 4 years that I left and made this modern day adventure. I was now ready to jump on the fast lane of the road less traveled. As I was preparing for my adventure, another synchronistic event happened, right? Again, the word synchronicity started to pop up more and more in my vocabulary, or at least later I would look back at it and clearly say that, wow, this is truly about synchronicity. A local mailing that just listed classifieds and advertisements that I just had picked up in my mail, and I was sitting in the living room. And at that point, there was no wind or anything else there, but it just fell on the floor, and I'm not even sure why or how. And I was sort of curious. I went over to go pick that up. And how it had opened up, it unfolded, and on that page was this image, here that caught my attention. It was titled Visions of Tomorrow, and it referenced spiritual growth. I was blown away. It just, wow, it felt so right? Just like I had felt when I read the call initially. And amazing, it was to start today or that same day. So I called the number and a man answered. He said, this is interesting. I usually don't answer the phone, especially now that the conference has started, but something about this call I knew was important, and I answered it. Wow. So again, so strange to hear. Okay, all right, but he said, it's important for you to attend this conference. What the fuck? I wondered. I looked at the call, and which referred to being open to new experience, but I hung this up in my house at the time. I'm going. Here was the adventure, right? The adventure was about to begin. I jumped on a motorcycle and headed to the conference, only a few miles away, of all things. A decision I would be really glad that I made. Right? Here's the road less traveled, and I'm on it. The conference hosted several hundred people who shared deep spiritual interests and a thirst to learn more. It was, wow, people there were just like me. I couldn't believe it. Although they spoke with expressions and concepts I was unfamiliar with, healings, near-death experience, intuition, chakras, etc., this was the first time I heard conversation on topics that related so much to what I was contemplating. I was skeptical at first, thinking that maybe there's some kind of a cult. I just very wary, of this. But you know what? It felt right, and I decided I was going to go with the experience. I realized as I spent time meeting with others, these were people that were a lot like me. Then there were teachers there that consisted of Native American Indians, gurus from various disciplines and cultures, healers, highly intuitive individuals that provided readings and more. What I learned was that the term spiritual referred to those who had a thirst to learn of life outside of organized religion. I felt like I belonged somewhere for the first time in my life, but I still remain skeptical, so not to get absorbed into something that I would later regret. The biggest impact came from a middle-aged man who told the most amazing story about how he died and experienced the afterlife. It had a name, near-death experience, NDE. And amazingly, his name was Tom Sawyer. Can you believe it? It was great. It was time for my worldly adventure to begin. After all of this, I left the experience and this whole topic discussion. There could be so much to be written just about what I'd learned at that conference. But nevertheless, I knew my next step was that worldly travel based on the adventure that I had in Europe. And again, coincidentally, right? A woman at the conference named Margaret, I met at the conference. She said she talked about traveling annually to South Africa, where her husband was from, and she volunteered there every year, volunteering in some of the native tribes that are out there, helping to learn better nutrition using the foods that they have access to. I'd watched a documentary on Africa shortly before making this connection and hearing of her story. One of the comments they made caught my attention. It suggested that if you want to understand the origins of humanity, Africa was the place to go. Again, very intriguing to me today, since I just really wanted to learn. I had a thirst now to learn so much more about the concept of humanity, why I'd experienced what I did, and really, where do I go from here? Margaret said that others were welcome to join her, but you had to pay your own way. So over the course of the next couple of months, I collected what I had in the savings, and I called her and I said, I'm going, right? And so, but during the next couple of months, prior to that call, just again, the word Africa came up a number of times. And then I, at one point, recalled Margaret's story at the conference about her adventures. I called her and she stated that she was awaiting my call. She said, literally, "Hi, Michael. I was expecting you to call me." Again, what the fuck? What is this kind of a stuff? Again, there was some words and terminology I was beginning to experience that still seemed very do. But I had an open mind. I promised myself to keep an open mind. And I was sort of just putting all of these experiences, into my brain at that point. It was just an exciting and scary time at the same time. The leg of the road less traveled now began with an 18-hour nonstop flight, the longest nonstop flight that existed from New York City to Johannesburg, South Africa. And there I was on my way, not knowing anything about what was about to happen and unfold. It felt like I was in one of the National Geographic episodes I watched on TV. Life here was so profoundly different than anything I experienced within the US. We would stay in mud huts at times that overlooked the actual desert plains, had a view of the wildlife that was only seen in pictures. I'll never forget, and just again, example of one of my stories is just at night, I'd be hearing the sounds of wildlife outside, and it happened to be a near full moon, and I edged open this little wood door that was on one opening to our mud hut, just with a crack to be able to look out. And there was all this incredible wildlife, all of these animals that you only would see on like the National Geographic that were right outside, that were gnawing on the grass or playing in the fields. It was an incredible experience. We traveled each day to one of the tribal areas where arrangements had already been made for us to visit. A few spoke English, a result of some of the outreach programs that were there before, along with the European influence that was in Africa. The amazing thing, there was no concept of time, right? There was no watches, no clocks. I mean, was no concept time, no days of the week. No one even had an age. There was no clocks, no phones, no computers. All of that stuff was modern. This was back into the beginnings of humanity, right? The tribal aspect of living. My task there, we all had to volunteer with some capacity to be able to help and work with these tribal areas. Well, I was several years a volunteer as an EMT or emergency medical technician on a volunteer ambulance that I was back home. My job was to help them find ways to be able to deal with first aid using, again, what they had, the sticks and materials and the leather they had from the skins that would come from the animals that they killed for food. And I would help them to be able to learn how to apply first aid to the different kinds of incidences that they would happen being out in nature all day, but only the materials they had access to. It was an incredible challenge, and it was so much fun. My contact, there was what was referred to as a Sangoma, or a healer. Actually, the name of Sangoma also ties into witch doctor. Well, it wasn't the witch doctor in the concept that maybe we consider it, but it was really clearly something very different. It is near impossible to find words to describe sitting across from a local native who wore a tribal outfit, sort of just the grass type kind of skirts, minimal other clothing on. And there he did. Was sitting on this dirt floor, and he pulled out a bag of bones and stones and other things that were in this bag of bones. And he was there to actually give me what was translated as a reading. So we threw the bones out on the floor, and he went on to accurately describe my life. I mean, he had no clue, no concept of my life in progressive day or within the US. But he used terms and terminology, that was like, oh my God, I was blown away. Some might say, well, it was generic enough to do that, but no, it was very specific. And it covered things that were very characteristic. I remember at one point, for example, two chicken bones, one lied across of the other. And he said is a primary relationship has become entangled. And again, I can't remember if the words were like entangled or not, but there were enough to be able to understand, or be able to relate to the words I just shared. And he referred to that, and he said that, and not in a good way. And and he picked up bones will cause this to break. I mean, a broken relationship. Oh God, if that was it's not so accurate as it was a case study of what my life was at that point. But it was my open mind that was I just found continually blown away for 4 years. I just would say that there's a great value to the expression being blown away by an event. Well, it was over time, it was chipping away at all of what were my prior belief systems, my prior thoughts about life, as I experienced so many of these unusual and unique situations. And it was beginning to sort of break away this mold of what I had formed of perceptions to become now a very open mind in terms of looking at the world in much more broader sense than I'd ever seen before. My time there was characteristic of what Michael Crichton stated to be, quote, stripped of your ordinary surroundings, your friends, your daily routines, your refrigerator full of your food, your closet full of clothes. It reminded me of a saying from The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy, said to her dog Toto, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore, right? For me, is this, no, we're not in the US anymore. The story above represents one of 1,000 profound events. I'm not kidding. 1,000 easy, profound events that took place for the better part of my 4-year vision quest. My adventures would bring me to Russia, Eastern Europe, and then returning to Africa. I met the most amazing people, learned about very different cultures, beliefs, customs, and more. I experienced the incredible diversity and contrast of life here on Earth. I traveled simply and found hostels to stay in or people's homes to stay in that had opened up the doors for me for incredibly cheap prices. $1 bought me a night stay in virtually any part of Africa. No wonder so many young adults outside the US that I met there were traveling the world, right? It was more customary for them to do that, a concept that I don't think ever really took hold here in the US. As I arrived at each new destination on my tour of duty, right? And I say a tour like it was planned, but it was not. I literally went with the wind. I tell stories of how when I'd come back at breaks and come back to my home within the US for a little bit to start thinking about my next adventure. One thing I often did is I had one of those globes, right? That the sort of the earth you'd spin, on a little spindle that was out there. Well, I would spin that and I'd step back and I had one of those little pistols that shot those little suction type things, and I'd shoot it, and where the suction cup landed on the earth is where I traveled to next. That was literally how I made my decisions of where to go next, for the most part. A few times there were reasons for that. I'd love to cover those. I think I talk about that in the Modern Day Vision Quest. But in essence, that was sort of the randomness that I had now within life. There are places that were so distraught that I had visited that made my life of trauma feel like I was, that I had vacation compared to what they were experiencing. Such places as the townships right in South Africa, just massive zones of thousands, if not millions, who live there in tin shacks and cardboard and live just an incredibly difficult life. Other places displayed the lives of the rich and famous. So I saw again this contrast between these different aspects of life. In every case, my experience consisted of just meeting people and the joy of connecting with them, telling them a little bit about my story, which would then often provoke conversation. And I'd ask them the similar questions I'd have been exposed to or that I was considering, and listened to their stories over and over and over about their life, aspiration, dreams, beliefs, and more. It was as if I was getting a doctorate degree on life itself with a minor in self-discovery. I would never view life here on Earth as the same, and would laugh at how news sources back home would share international events without any clear understanding of what was the real story, and how I had subscribed to those things hook, line, and sinker because I wasn't exposed to them firsthand. This is the value, again, of experiencing things firsthand to really not only get the story, but to experience the impact and change that it has on self. So here's an example of a day in the life for me on the road less traveled. So I was staying in a hostel in Cape Town, right? I was on my own, just basically going through, after my time that I went there with Margaret, which was about a 4-month stay, and I wanted to return. And so I stayed in the youth hostel, and it was I had met a person, again, synchronistically now, I would say, clearly, who had learned about what I was doing and said, oh, you should come with me. I actually helped to coordinate volunteers going to the township in north of Cape Town called Khayelitsha. And this is, again, one of the many townships that were housed by millions of Black South Africans that were basically pushed in to these ghetto, really much worse than ghetto experiences as we know them here in the US, because that's where they were forced to live under the whole concept of apartheid. One evening, a few other backpackers asked me what I was doing. They were curious and intrigued to what I was telling them. I stated that it's really challenging work, listening to stories of things that are very difficult to hear, but I'd return each day just to go back to experience more of these stories. And so they asked if they went. I was able to get permission that I needed to be able to get them to do, and it was granted. We then arrived and were under the guidance and protection of Sergeant Natawe, and he was what an incredible and wonderful person. He lived right there in the township, and yet his role was to be equivalent of a police officer. We traveled around the endless sea of the tin shacks, which were the homesteads of tens of thousands who lived there. We met a number of these individuals who lived there and talked about their lives, their stories. It was more about survival than anything else, and dealing with rampant crime, disease, famine, and more. It was so difficult at first to listen to these stories. But then as I thought about my own pain and my past, I realized that in a strange way, we really connected. And that would really prove so beneficial to my experience there from my part as well as their own. The conversations were so hard to listen to. It was literally a hellish experience. I could not imagine living in these circumstances, which were the result of one of the major human tragedies, apartheid. All we could do is listen and empathize. I stated how frustrated and overwhelmed I was about listening to their stories, their situations. And I remember saying so many times that I'm sorry, I don't know what I can do. I certainly can't change. It is so big in scope. And it was at the end of the journey that they stated to me that I did indeed provide them with a real gift. The gift, as they said, was that I provided them was the interest I had in their lives as member of the Caucasian race from halfway around the world. To them, they couldn't understand. Well, I would travel halfway across the world, and instead of living all of the wonderful life of leisure and the things like you could find in Cape Town, South Africa, I was choosing to spend time there. They couldn't understand that. At one point, they sang a song of gratitude to me. I still feel it today. I sobbed with so many tears, with wonderful tears. It was the most amazing gift. I had ever received in my life. They literally had given me only thing that they owned, the elements of themselves, in this case, their music, which was amazing throughout my Africa experience. It was time for me and the others from the hostel to return to Cape Town. The three guests said nothing during the ride home. Once we arrived back at the hostel, they returned to a binge of drinking alcohol for several days, and they avoided me like I had the plague. Then finally, one of them spoke up. I was still going to volunteering at Kailishi each day, and they finally spoke up and said that they were so overwhelmed and anger with what they saw and heard, had no idea to process this. So they turned to what we do, right? Alcohol, to diffuse it, to avoid this element of pain and realizations of having your eyes ripped wide open. I really could relate to this because I was feeling the same thing. I had pushed myself, and it was again because it had fallen under the banner and being willingness to open myself to new experiences and everything is what kept me going. It was the same reaction I had at the end of my first week volunteering at the township. It was the fact that this was real, not something that you saw on television. It was right there. I could touch it, feel it, smell it, hear it, all the five sensory experience. There was no turning off the TV here, however, or switching to a different channel. All five senses were immersed. They were overloaded, in fact. And it was my mentor who set up this volunteer opportunity that talked me off the ledge when I said that I didn't want to come back. It would take years for me to process so much of what I experienced during my travels, including stops like at Kailicha. There would be many more situations that I would encounter face to face. It hurts like hell to have your eyes forced open. There's no way to sugarcoat that. For some sitting there saying, no way in hell I'd do something like that. I get it. I totally do. You just have to be drawn. And that was the case with me. That's what did it. Drew me into the line of fire. And I was okay with that because in many ways, it was helping me address that hurt that I had, the pain and suffering, the abuse and the things, only to realize that it was characteristic of humanity all over the place. It was just different ways that the pain and suffering were inflicted. Once again, it relates to heeding the call. Most people have had times where they obviously knew they needed to do something, even though it may have made no sense at the time. We each have intuitive capabilities, something later I would learn in life. Sometimes I refer to it as a gut feeling. Later on, I actually described this as maybe my higher self. In my case, the feeling was deep, very deep into the core of my being. It was something that I felt numerous times in my life, often writing these feelings off as nonsense. I just knew in my heart that I had to escape from my life experience that felt like I was living behind that fence. Remember that thing I drew in my journal was me sitting there residing behind a fence. So I was now outside of the fence and realized, wow, this is a big place. This scary place is filled with challenges and filled with great things. And to discover what was out there, which I came to learn was actually learning to discover what was in there, inside me. So that's about enough for now. I know I've carried on for quite a bit. You hopefully have had interest if you've gotten this far. I'll actually conduct part 2 of this, as my next podcast recording. Thanks for those who did listen. Thanks for giving it some time. Thanks for giving it some thought, and hopefully it helped to challenge you in some way as you maybe are considering your own life and growth.